This is the second coffee break workshop in the Net Zero Industrial Cluster Exchange Network series. And just to tell you a little bit more about NECCUS, it's a knowledge sharing platform focusing on regional and local development strategies that can effectively support transformation of regions and cities towards decarbonisation and net zero. And the coffee break workshops are a part of that kind of knowledge exchange engagement activity. My name's Hannah Corbett. I'm a Knowledge Exchange Fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy at the University of Strathclyde, but I've also been working with colleagues in NICE and also the European Policies Research Centre. So it's great to be part of this workshop today. Antonios Katris, who is a research fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy, is actually going to be giving the presentation today and looking in more detail about ensuring how do we ensure that we have the right workforce to deliver net zero project delivery. So the format of the event will have about 20 minutes for Antonios to present. And then we're really, it's really great that we've got Pauline Anderson and Mark Hughes here, who will act as discussants, and I'll introduce them a little bit later. And then there'll be plenty of time after that for Q&A. Just a bit of housekeeping in terms of asking questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so. You can either do that by raising a hand or putting it in the chat, and colleagues here, including myself, will keep an eye on the chat just to see what Q&A is being raised there. And also, just before I introduce Antonios, I wanted to just let you all know that the meeting's been recorded, which means you can, you and other colleagues can follow the meeting at a later stage, and it will also be available on the NICE YouTube channel, on the NICE website, and shared with you by email. And if you'd like to tweet during the session or afterwards, you can do, and be grateful if you could use the hashtag #NiceNetCBW. But I will, perhaps someone could just put that in the chat as well, just so people have got it to hand. Okay. Without further ado, I will introduce Antonios, who's our speaker today, a colleague at the Centre for Energy Policy. He's been working there since 2015, so pretty much since it was established. Antonios is uses computer general equilibrium modelling and does that to study the economy-wide impacts of different net zero actions and policies, with a view to sort of identifying the trade-offs and implications for policy and other stakeholders. He has been working across the net zero space, including looking at the improvement of energy efficiency in residential properties, electrification of private transport, and exploring the impacts of offshoring industrial activity. He works on a number of projects, including one recently looking at the nuclear decommissioning in the Scottish economy, but also on those funded by the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre, looking at labour markets and industrial decarbonisation, and Scotland's Net Zero Infrastructure Programme. So he's got a wealth of experience, and I think this will be a really timely presentation today, given recent announcements by UK government in relation to powering up Britain, a focus on local content and supply chains in relation to those activities, but also what's going on more globally, whether that's the US Inflation Reduction Act or similar kind of activities and policy initiatives in Europe. So I think this will be a really timely presentation, and I look forward to a really great discussion. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Antonios and let him present.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Let me share my screen. Just bear with me one moment. Can I check that everyone can see the screen properly, and also now see the presentation full screen? Yeah?
Perfect. Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. So yeah, as Hannah said in her introduction, I'm Antonios Katris. I'm working at the Centre for Energy Policy here at the University of Strathclyde. And I have to apologize in advance if I have to take some small breaks to drink some water, but the the weather doesn't really agree with me in some ways. But that's just to excuse myself if necessary. To start the presentation, one of the things that we tend to emphasize when we present to external stakeholders is that as a center, what we're looking to and what we're doing is that we're working to ensure that the mid-century transition to the net zero targets, essentially what they do is that they deliver sustainable and equitable prosperity. And the core of our work, our general approach, is one where is basically supported by 5 what we call the net zero principles. So it's of paramount importance to us to understand who really pays how and when for the different decarbonization actions, and also what kind of gains can be used to to balance any costs that occur as part of the transition to net zero. We also think that it's key to grow in a way that is equitable, so not leaving significant parts of the society behind. It's also important to exploit any opportunities to deliver near-term economic returns if that is possible. We don't see offshoring as an option because it's not just a case of shifting emissions away from the UK, but it's also shifting jobs and value added and general welfare abroad, overseas. And ultimately, we see the net zero transition as a societal and public policy challenge rather than a technological one, and often is portrayed in as a significant technological challenge. There are multiple technologies. The societal and public policy side are particularly important, and we think that we need to emphasize on this quite a bit. So Hannah mentioned that my work is usually done using this computable general equilibrium model. This is absolutely the case. I'm not going to go into excruciating details of what this involves. The important elements that are useful for this presentation and to be able to follow what I'm going to be discussing later on are that essentially these models are considering the wider economy. They consider all the sectors involved, all the markets involved. So you don't focus on a very specific part of the economy, you focus on the broader economic picture and you see the broader economic impacts. And as a final introductory slide, let's say, although we work, as Hannah mentioned, myself, but not just myself, my colleagues as well, we work across a wide range of net zero transition actions and climate change policies. We tend to focus across all of them on some core questions. So, for example, one that is very common is to try and understand what are the economy-wide impacts of introducing and implementing different net zero actions, actions that contribute to the targets that they are already in place for 2050. And I'm giving some examples here that Hannah has already mentioned, so I'm not going to go into detail in the interest of time. But what is important to mention is that we mostly have a UK focus in our work, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the key messages coming out are UK specific. There are messages that are relevant across different countries, and I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. A second question that is also very common in our work is how key areas of policy interest, for example, employment, household consumption, or the government budget balance, are affected by introducing different net zero actions, and crucially, what are the distributional impacts, both at the sectoral level, but also across different households, particularly different household income groups. And I assume, from the fact that I have emphasized as much as I could the word employment. You'll see that this presentation is going to be focusing quite a bit on this specific topic. But before we get into that, we also explore in our work what are the kind of trade-offs that are emerging and key policy considerations associated with our findings. I will be discussing some of them later on, but it's also important to understand to what extent changes in the broader economic landscape, changes in the assumptions that we make in terms of how the economy might look moving into the future, how do those changes essentially affect the kind of insights and trade-offs that we identify as part of our work. So this was the very brief introduction that I wanted to make in relation to the CEP work. And now I want to focus a bit more on the labor market specifically, because obviously this is the main focus here of this presentation and this seminar. We find that there are a number of drivers that they are important when you look at impacts associated with the labor market. So the first one is whether you have a fixed labor supply or if you have constraints. And these constraints can be at the national level. So you may have a finite pool of labor within the country, but they also can be identified. They can be found at the regional level or at very specific industries as well. What these constraints are doing, they basically can drive the wage competition, and the wage competition essentially can come as a result of different sectors or different projects trying to get people from this finite pool of labor that I'm talking about. And the implication of that is that you can get to a position where you have higher wages and higher labor costs more broadly, which obviously pushes the cost of production upwards and can introduce higher prices across the economy, which with implications then on the competitiveness of the industries and also the broader cost of living. Of course, there are mitigation actions and some trade-offs that are emerging here as well. So in relation to the labor supply constraints, for instance, one mitigation action would be to bring employees from abroad so that you expand your labor pool in this way, or you can expand it by supporting greater full-time participation in the labor market. Or one other approach that you can use in this respect is to, without expanding your labor market, make it more productive, so be able to produce more without the need to bring more labor in. When you get to the wage competition side of things, a very obvious mitigation action is that you can train the labor force, or train the new labor force, or retrain the existing workforce to have some specific skills that have been identified as lacking, as having a gap in the economy. Because if this is not done, the trade-off is precisely what I have been talking about. You can find yourself in a situation where you have upward real wage pressures as the unemployment rate is falling, because essentially workers use their bargaining power to get better wages. And this takes us into another trade-off that is linked to the wider costs, because obviously higher wages is a desirable outcome for people that are working in certain sectors. But this can, on the flip side, can introduce some higher prices across the economy and essentially push the cost of living upwards, which is not a desirable outcome. And in that respect, what you could do is to essentially try and find some kind of sources of competitive advantages or increase the productivity, not the labor productivity, but the broader productivity of the sectors affected, in order to essentially use this approach to keep the prices down. This is the very kind of fundamental, the very basic understanding that is necessary in order to, to realize how the different wage pressures and price pressures might emerge in the economy. But then we can move into more practical examples of how this can manifest in the work that we have done. And here I'm starting with the example of developing a transport and storage sector for captured CO2. We have done this for different combinations, but here I'm focusing on the transport and storage sector developed to service the truck one clusters, with a scope to be operational by 2025 in this particular example. And obviously, because you need the infrastructure in place ahead of the CCUS network being operational, you need to initially oversize the infrastructure, make it bigger than the demand that is already in place. What this is doing is that it introduces significant labor requirements to develop this infrastructure, which, as you can see in the graph, in the first 3 years leads to net employment gains, which generally is a favorable outcome. And we can also see that when there is some kind of real wage rigidity, this is the case of we refer to as fixed real wage assumption. It's the yellow line, the yellow dash line in the graph. In this case, we get better employment and better GDP outcomes compared to a case where you have a more flexible real wage assumption. And this is the blue lines that I have included there. I'll explain why as we move on. And to understand why, we need to have a look at the sectoral level picture, which is different compared to the net picture, the economy-wide picture, especially under our more flexible bargain real wage assumption. We can see, and this is the small side graph on the left-hand side, that you have net employment gains in the wider economy, but these are mainly driven, they're mainly supported by the requirements in the construction sector. At the same time, as you can see in the blue bars, you can have employment losses across a number of sectors. So what is happening here is that the labor market constraints and the significant labor requirements in this very specific part of the economy, what they do is they drive the labor cost upwards across the economy. And although this is not necessarily a major issue for the sectors that they are involved in the infrastructure development, it is negatively affecting very labor-intensive sectors like services. So the right-hand side of the bar chart, or manufacturing industries that they are not directly or as exposed to the directly involved or as exposed to the infrastructure development process. Essentially, what is happening is you get higher production costs and therefore competitiveness losses for the vast majority of the industrial sectors in the UK in this case, which means less demand both domestically and internationally, and hence the need to reduce the number of employees they have. The important thing here is that if you remove those labor constraints, or if you lessen those labor constraints, so looking at the case of the fixed real wage assumption, then the labor cost impacts are significantly smaller. In the fixed real wage case, the wages are only adjusting in line with, the labor cost is only adjusting in line with the CPI. And what this is doing, it basically leads to smaller increases in the economy-wide labor cost. You have employment losses in less sectors, and where you still have some losses, they are of smaller magnitude. And essentially, this is why we see the better economy-wide outcomes that I mentioned a few slides before. The better economy-wide outcomes when you compare the fixed real wage and the bargain real wage cases. Essentially, what is happening is that because you have smaller price increases, this allows a greater demand, both domestic and exported, which in turn creates more employment opportunities and supports further demand and so on. But the important thing here, and something that really needs to be taken into consideration, is that all the impacts that I've been discussing about are conditional on the fact that we do have the labor force to meet the labor requirements presented here, even if that needs to be done at a higher cost than what we would want, for example. In these scenarios, we can see that at the very least, you need around 17,500 full-time equivalent employed workers in 2023 in the construction sector in order to basically enable this whole process. And in this case, because we're talking about the development of transport and storage network, quite a few of these people will need to have specific skills. So this raises the question, do we actually have the labor force to support this kind of requirements? If the answer is yes, this is good news. But if the answer is no, or not at the necessary numbers, then the economy-wide outcomes that I have been discussing here could be worse than the bargain real wage outcomes that I've been showing so far, or even lead to projects being cancelled or postponed, and along them losing or getting at a later stage any benefits that could come alongside those projects being implemented. The thing is that the aforementioned challenges, they're not unique to the transport and storage development. Essentially, whatever you need to do some kind of activity, some kind of enabling activity as part of a net zero action, you will see similar challenges emerging. So here we have a program to bring as many homes as possible to EPC Band C. And what we see here is that the timing of how you time the activity across the duration of such programs is important. We consider three very broad cases, so early, steady, or late action. And if we focus specifically on the labor implications, if you opt to act early, we can see that we have similar challenges as the one that I have been discussing about the transport and storage case. So here, for example, we see that in the first year, you will need over 100,000 FTE workers to basically retrofit properties. And this number stays over 57,000 even until year 3. So the problem is, the challenge here is whether you have the skilled people to do this kind of work, but also there is an additional challenge that there could be overlapping skill requirements with other projects or other decarbonization actions. And as it was the case in the transport and storage case, where you have significant labor requirements, these push the labor cost upwards, and it basically leads to transitory, in this case, negative economy-wide impacts. And in principle, what you can do is to time the activity in different ways, which can help you address some of the labor-related issues. So a steady action approach could help reduce the labor requirements to around 46,000 workers. And with late action, even though you need a larger number because you need to cover for other requirements as well, you still give yourself more time to train the labor force. But this comes with its own trade-offs, and that's where we get back to the whole trade-offs that I was mentioning before, that when you go with steady action, for example, in this example, you need to have policy support over at least 3 parliamentary terms, which is not guaranteed. It's not a given. And even worse, in the a late action, if you lose your support in the last parliamentary term, so in the last 5 years, you have a program that was supposed to deliver a very substantial kind of benefit in terms of improving the efficiency of households across the UK, but you're basically, because you lost policy support at the last term, you might find yourself implementing only half of it or less than half of it. And similar challenges you can identify if you're talking about the electrification of residential heating. Here we're thinking about through the use of heat pumps. We see, for instance, in the peak year of heat pump installation, that you can have requirements of approximately 20,000 qualified workers to install heat pumps. And one of the additional challenges here are having a pool of them concentrated in one location might not be ideal, because the demand is likely to be spread across the country. So this is an additional challenge. Plus, in the same year, because you need to upgrade the network to cope with the additional demand, you also need around 4,000 people that are able to help to work, on this particular type of activity. So we can see the impacts of constrained labor here as well. They are evident as they were before. The increased labor requirement, what they do is that they push the economy-wide, the labor cost upwards across the economy, and the labor-intensive sectors, as it was the case in transport authorities, are the ones that they usually face the biggest challenges because of the increased labor cost. But the thing that we need to keep in mind here is that the activities that I have been discussing about, we consider them in isolation between one another, especially when we're talking about installing heat pumps or retrofitting properties. There is a very significant potential for skills overlapping. As I said, particularly in these two net zero actions, and where there is a potential for skills overlaps, whatever labor constraints are in place, essentially the impacts of those constraints can be further aggravated and further aggravate any labor cost pressures that are associated with those constraints. But just to try and kind of close the presentation, if I was to give three take-home messages for those of you who attend the presentation just now, or those of you who are watching it later on, a key message to start with is that whenever you have some kind of enabling activity, which is either infrastructure development or retrofitting of residential properties or installing some kind of equipment, if you need this kind of activity for a net zero action, this will lead to some kind of increased labor requirement in part of the economy. That's something to be expected. Now, if the labor force does not include the appropriate skills and the appropriate numbers of skilled workers to meet these increased demands, then there is a high likelihood that there will be negative pressures in the wider economy. This will likely be in the form of increased labor costs, because the limited number of workers, they use the bargaining power they have to get better wages. That's what we would anticipate. But of course, there is the potential, if there are significant gaps in the skilled labor requirements, that you might have projects being postponed or cancelled, with subsequent impacts on whether or when you will get any benefits that you were anticipating as a result of those projects. And there are potential mitigation actions that they range from timing of the necessary activities or bringing in labor from abroad. But there are, for each mitigation action, there are important trade-offs So as part of the policy design, it is key to consider those trade-offs and plan for them. And one last thing that I wanted to cover, and I'll have a sip of water before I do, just to address the question of whether these are UK-specific challenges. Yes, our main focus is obviously in the UK or Scotland as a devolved nation, but it's not necessarily the case that these are UK-specific challenges. The main driver, the main factor driving the impacts that I have been discussing about is whether there are labor market constraints which essentially drive the wage and, by extension, price pressures. Any country or any group of countries that faces similar constraints is likely to face similar impacts as well. However, the magnitude and the severity of the constraints present will also dictate what kind of impact, the exact nature and magnitude of impacts that you can anticipate. I'm giving two examples here just to try and frame it, but in the interest of time and to allow the discussion to continue beyond what I have to say. If, for example, you go in a country B, that has less certified installers than the UK, but they have an ambition to try and install the same number of heat pumps as the UK is looking to do just now, then it's likely that the pressures on the economy can be considerably larger, because a smaller pool of qualified labor will have much bigger bargaining power and much bigger influence on the wages across the economy. But one last point in relation to translating UK, the outputs and the insights from applied work that you can find for different countries. It is important to be cautious in trying to generalize the insights from specific applied work. As I said, some fundamental learnings are usually transferable, especially those that have to do with the fundamental drivers behind the impacts that you observe. But each country or each region may also have particular and unique circumstances that will play a role in determining what kind of expected outcomes you may have. So if anyone wants to extract more accurate and more kind of relevant insights, they need to take into consideration these unique circumstances that we are not, we in the UK, folks in the UK context, or anyone else in a different context, cannot capture because we don't have the necessary information. And on that note, I'd like to thank you and also apologize to Hannah for being quite over the time.
Well, that's okay. Thank you, Antonios, and thanks for such a great and interesting presentation. Some real tricky policy dilemmas there for regional, national, local, and international level, whether that be net zero, realising net zero ambitions, or sort of ensuring economic development and just transition. So before I open up questions to the floor, I'm going to ask Dr. Pauline Anderson and Mark Hughes from NECCUS to give some 5-minute reflections each on Antonios's presentation and the series of issues that he's raised. It's great to have them both here. Pauline is a senior lecturer and director of knowledge exchange in the Department of Work, Employment and Organisation. That's within Strathclyde University Business School. So Pauline does a lot of work focusing around skills, jobs and working life, with a focus on green jobs and skills. And she's a member, so recent and current projects include looking at low-paid workforce and transition to net zero, and different skills ecosystems and principles for a just transition. Pauline also serves on the Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan Implementation Steering Group, so can bring both academic and policy insights. Mark is operations manager at NECCUS, and the NECCUS is a membership body of companies, government bodies, consultants and academia focused on decarbonising industry and delivering for net zero by 2045, and actively promotes and champions industrial decarbonisation across Scotland. And they're very active, and we collaborate with a number of different organisations, and we have experience of working with NECCUS through the Scotland's Net Zero Infrastructure Programme, and NECCUS were also very involved with Scotland's Net Zero Roadmap. So again, Mark brings a wealth of sort of policy knowledge and expertise to the discussion. So if I can ask Pauline perhaps just to reflect briefly on Antonios's presentation.
Can you hear me okay? Just to check first.
Yeah,
Hannah?
I can hear you, Pauline. Yeah.
Thanks, and thanks so much for inviting me. Antonios, that was a great presentation, and my mind's slightly overwhelmed with some of the jobs and skills challenges. I know I'll try and keep this to the 5 minutes because I know it's important to get some discussion after. I suppose from my point of view, some of the things that strike me, which, as you know, are quite obvious. So rather than the question, how do we get the workforce to net zero, I was thinking more about what workforce do we need to get to net zero. And it's great when we do the scenario planning, and it's great when we think things through at kind of general labour market demands, but I'm thinking at the level of individual jobs and skills. So where are these jobs? You know, we're talking about there's 17,500 workers in construction needed in 2023 for the UK. Is that people already working in the construction industry? There is also, given that the construction industry, like many industries, are so fragmented, the problem of poaching and driving up labour costs is a real issue, because there is just much more attractive sectors of the industry to work in, the domestic sector, for example. So that's a big challenge. The other challenge I thought was what exactly, where you have to get down to the level of jobs, because if you're going to address skills problems, what jobs are you talking about and where are they? Do you envision what kind of skills are needed for these jobs? I'm guessing a lot of these jobs are jobs that just require top-up training. So who's going to provide the money for that when we know the Scottish Government, and I don't want to keep this really local, but the Scottish Government's Transition Training Fund is on hold just now. There's also issues around apprenticeship. So a lot of training we know can actually, once you look at an actual job profile, a lot of these jobs seem like new jobs, but actually you can have two very short micro credentials can be levered to upskill them. So that's a big challenge. So from my point of view, it's what kind of jobs are they? Where are they located? What's the skills profile? Where are the gaps? Are these jobs that we anticipate people moving from the sunrise, from sunset to sunrise areas? Are these brand new jobs? You were talking about job losses in some sectors. So what does that, what's going to happen to these people? And is there an opportunity to upskill, reskill people to move in? I think another thing that struck me is we've obviously got international policy agendas such as the ILO's decent work. So apart from, are these jobs decent jobs, which would include, do they pay well, but also how sustainable are these jobs? You know, once the retrofitting and the switching's been done, are we only interested in training people for very short-term projects, or is there a longer-term strategy we can look to have jobs that people could work across a range of, to deliver a range of these projects? The other obvious issue that I don't want to keep going on about is construction, and a lot of these jobs are require very traditionally male skills that tend to be disproportionately held by men. So how do we ensure that we're opening up opportunities for a broader group of people? And the other thing is you're talking about labour supply. What are we ensuring that local communities aren't left behind? How can we tap some of the local talent? You know, if there'll be some very highly skilled jobs that you're going to have to look at the international labour market, but is there ways that we can support local people to deliver, to upskill and reskill local people for local jobs? And the final issue, as you say, a lot of these jobs are jobs that require on the move and labour mobility. So how do we deal with that? So I suppose the big thing for me is we have to get down to the level of the actual jobs and job numbers and look at skills gap. And also, how are we supporting employers? How we support employers? Like a lot of these jobs, we can't just click our fingers and all these skills are here. So how are we supporting employers to start to think about shorter and medium-term strategies for developing their future workforce? So I've pushed everything, and what I would say is we've got a great report that we did on green skills and jobs in Scotland, and a lot of what we did was look at these kind of issues. And one of the big things that we're doing just now is looking at trying to get labour market information real time. So we've been working with Warwick University, and they've been collecting data since February 2019, and we're looking at the changing landscape across the UK in terms of labour demand, and that's a really nice way of trying to anticipate what we do in terms of skills and training. I'm going to shut up, Hannah. I've spoke. Poor Mark's got about 2 minutes at this rate, but I loved it. Loads of questions, and I'll put some things in the chat.
Great. Thanks so much, Pauline. Some really interesting points raised there. And yeah, please do share the report. I think that would be really useful and interesting for everyone else. Mark, I'll hand over to you, but perhaps as part of that, you might want to pick up on the supporting employers question that Pauline raised, or just maybe reflect on that in terms of some of the work that you've been doing, engaging with organisations and companies in developing local supply chains. Sorry,
yes, I can do that, Hannah. Yeah, I'll try and do that. I'll try and do that as quickly as I can. I'll make a distinction though. For NECCUS, we're obviously focused on industrial decarbonisation. So, you know, residential, transport, retail, all that kind of stuff is kind of out with our remit. So we focus purely on industrial decarbonisation, technology agnostic, whatever technology is appropriate for each facility location. We will certainly promote that. As you say, we're a member organisation. We've got members ranging from large multinationals to smaller independent energy consultancies, local government, obviously academia, which is big, and University of Strathclyde is a big part of that. We've been involved in a couple of national programmes lately. We've just completed SNESR, Scotland's Net Zero Roadmap, and we work obviously with Strathclyde and other partners on Scotland's Net Zero Infrastructure project as well. And through those projects, there's been various studies that have been commissioned looking at the supply chain and the availability of skills or the lack of. And I'll just touch on a few of those studies that we've been involved in. Antonios had a lot of numbers there as well, and the numbers will typically vary, but from SNESR studies, we've talked about potentially 15,000 jobs. From in SNESR itself, economic impact assessments with a peak of potential 12,000 jobs. We also commissioned a study via IDRIC and the University of Chester, which was a supply chain skills analysis report, and they talked about potentially 23,500 jobs as an opportunity on an annual basis going forward as well. Some of the things that came out of that study were, you know, the requirements for construction workers, and they reckoned there's an estimated construction skills gap of over 200,000 workers. So it's absolutely massive and significant. The one thing against the backdrop to that is that the government is targeting 4 operational industrial decarbonisation clusters by 2030. Now, 4 of those clusters between now and 2030, to get to that point, I mean, are we really seriously going to be looking at the same resource pool to try and make that happen? And when you put that on top of all the other infrastructure projects such as nuclear, HS2, hospital, schools, all that kind of stuff, then you're really looking at a kind of national planning and scheduling approach at that kind of level. That would be my take on some of these studies that have been done with ourselves. The other thing, and I know Pauline mentioned it there, was the Just Transition Commission, which is seen as a very, very positive step by the Scottish Government, that we have that, and we want to manage that transition properly, because we have experience of not doing it in the past. But just another risk involved in that is that we launched with DNV the Energy Transition Outlook report in Aberdeen just a few weeks ago. And DNV are predicting that fossil fuels will still be part of the energy mix by 2050. So to look at the just transition and looking at oil and gas, I don't think we can automatically assume that oil and gas workers will just make that transition. They may well follow what they know and follow the oil and gas production where it is internationally, because that's happened in the past and it's also likely to happen in the future. But I'll very quickly touch on practical experience through conversations with NECCUS members that are at the sharp end of this just now. Spoke last week with a UK-based high-end fabricator with facilities in Scotland and England. A very ambitious company, very ambitious plans for growth. They currently invest in plant and equipment and new facilities, but their key constraint at this moment in time is skilled labour. They cannot find, in particular, welders to do the jobs that they need to do. And the main issue is that to find welders is proven very, very difficult, and to find welders and train them up to the full competent level that they would need to do the high-end skilled jobs that they do can take up to 10 years. They've got multiple ITTs to respond to just now, and a lot of them are in the nuclear areas and things like that. To do the responses to inquiries, they need estimators, and they've been trying to recruit estimators for over a year and a half, and they can't get people with experience to come and do those jobs. They've taken an alternative approach, and they've basically recruited graduates to do these jobs, which brings a whole new onus in them, which is to train their personnel up to a level that if you'd had that experience, if you'd gone through the shop floor, you could do these jobs, you know, as an estimator, because you've got that background and experience. They've now had to go down the graduate route, which puts more of an onus in them to try and train their own people up in a different way than they would have done before. Design engineers is another skill that they've been trying. They said they could absorb at least four new design engineers into their business, and they cannot find the people to fulfill these positions. They mentioned the fact that they could go internationally to do this, but as Antonios talked about offshore, and that's not where we want to be. It's not what we want to do. If this opportunity is here, we want to capitalise on it. We want to keep it in Scotland and the UK, and we don't want to look elsewhere to try and fulfil these positions. So that was a real practical example. We're right here, right now. It's not in 5 years or 10 years' time where this crunch is going to come. It's here and now. I mean, this company want to grow. They want to capitalise on the opportunities that are being presented, but they cannot fulfil the positions that they've got to take that next step and bring in good jobs into their own local economies. So that's a practical experience, Hannah. So I'll call it quits at that just now.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark. It's good to hear that. It's good to hear the real life experience, because, and as you say, it's something that is playing out here and now, and the ambitions around net zero are ever more pressing, and to achieve those, yeah, this is something that really sort of needs to be grappled with. I wanted to, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to open the floor up to questions.